to make sure we're coordinating in different areas, that it's reaching towards a common outcome. These purely focusing on regional cooperation, even though they're pragmatically simpler, than sort of a grand European project, is sort of risking duplication and not really moving the project forward as such. I know it's a bit strange to talk about this in the British setting, Britain being one of the countries that actually has an independent defense policy, but I mean, even Britain will not be able to defend all its interests unilaterally. I think we've seen that in the debate domestically as well. So I mean, even though you may rightly think that some of the other 27 member states are not pulling their weight on what it takes, or maybe too small, I mean, I think having a collective discussion is still very much worthwhile and needed. And another thing that's coming out of the report, but it also touches on the issue of defense industries, there's a real need also to perhaps look at public-private partnerships as well, and getting, increasing that conversation, what sort of accents we should set in research and development to make sure we're staying competitive with the European defense market in the future. So coordination mechanisms, innovation, against the background of probably a decrease in spending. And the spending part, I mean, we're still the second largest, Europe is still the second largest investor in defense after the United States, but we're seeing a trend towards Europe and the US collectively spending less and less on defense, and these rising powers that I mentioned earlier spending more and more. It's still a long way away from crossing from the balance really shifting, but we can see trends, if they were to continue, that could prevent us from being able to play an active role in trouble spots that might potentially touch on European defense interests. I'd just like to close on, because I was earlier saying that perhaps it'll take a crisis or some what impetus it could take to get Europe to take seriously its sort of defense responsibility, or take serious even this issue area that we have to get more serious about defense spending and research and development. And I think I would suggest that perhaps one of these factors could be current trends in the United States and the way the budget cuts and austerity are affecting Washington as well. And what we're seeing in the US at the moment is that it's not just that politicians have realized that they need to cut defense as well as other areas, but due to sort of domestic differences between Democrats and Republicans, these cuts in defense are now an across-the-board phenomenon that will continue as long as there's no agreement reached, sequestration, which means that the US is not going to be it's not in a position to actually plan the way it does its defense cuts. They just have them across the board. They have long-term implications that we're not quite sure what they're going to be, but they're probably not going to be good. And what's quite conceivable is that there might be a crisis in the future where the US is not just not willing, but may not actually be able to assist us. And that's really call to arms in a way for Europe to, if that situation arises, I hope it doesn't, but that could be one of these crises that force Europeans to take seriously their responsibilities towards their own security and spend more on European defense.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. Certainly a point that was underlined by Rasmussen, as we were alluding to earlier. Lots to pick up on there.
Because this EU-NATO debate, obviously I can't provide the NATO perspective since I'm working for the EU, but I think in a way when it comes to capabilities, the problem isn't just the EU's problem, it's NATO's problem as well. And I would say that I could imagine that NATO officials, or for sure US officials, are, it's not necessarily so much under what institutional home these reforms take place, as long as they take place. At this point it's no longer really an institutional contest between the EU and NATO and what that stands for. That's it still sort of lingers, but it's not really the big problem anymore. The problem is that NATO and the EU collectively or separately will not be able to take care of their members' security if this situation continues. So it's NATO's problem as much as the EU's.
Indeed. Lots to pick up on there, particularly like that final thought that America America's fiscal cliff can be taken as a sort of sign of things to come if EU and Europe also find ourselves paralysed with making an agreement on this. Colm, Burke, I'm going to give the floor up to you if you want to respond to what you just had to say, or if you just want to say your piece first. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I'm delighted to be here. I always have to be very careful coming from Ireland, a country which has remained neutral for a long number of years, and it's not going to change its policy in the immediate future. When I was asked this conference, I decided to commission a research paper through the Oireachtas Library, the Irish Parliament, in relation to the Common Security and Defence Policy. And the research team produced a document which tracks the Common Security and Defence Policy over the last 25 years, and that paper is available online. It runs through about 49 pages, and I hope people might find it helpful. And it's dealing with it in 4 different areas: the Common Foreign and Security Policy and the Common Security and Defence Policy, the origins and the current context. Section 2 deals with the CFSP and CSDP since the Lisbon Treaty, and Section 3 deals with the challenges for the future of the CFSP. Where is the EU going with its security and defence policy? And the final section deals with Ireland's foreign and defence policy and its role as a neutral country in the overall context. I'm going to just touch on the challenges for the future of CFSP. Where is the EU going and with its security and defence policy? And then look at this, and in doing this paper, what we looked at is we've looked at 15 research documents that have been done over the last 2 to 3 years in order to get all of the information together. So I think in looking at this, there's a number of themes emerge on Europe's common foreign and security policy and challenges for the future. They can be loosely teamed into inward-looking and outward-looking challenges. And I'm just going to focus on the outward-looking challenges. Foreign policy and security issues have changed with the changing geopolitical environment. Is Europe relevant in a new multipolar world? How is Europe reacting to America's pivot policy? The international environment has shifted incrementally since the late 1990s, and it is no longer the unipolar world which emerged in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. In the international world, order power is more diffuse, and the West is no longer as dominant as it used to be. The multipolar world is creating an increasingly difficult operating environment for CFSP. Europe has been at the receiving end of globalization, and with the relative decline of the US, it finds it more difficult to find partners who will accommodate its distinctive conception of its foreign policy role. LSE, European Foreign Policy Unit, has argued that the EU is adjusting very slowly to the emergence of new players. Other players can provide what Europe cannot. The profound effect that the euro crisis is having on the EU's foreign policy is highlighted. It negatively affected EU policy in 2 ways. One, by draining attention from foreign policy in general and limiting both the attention and resources devoted to it. And 2, by severely denting the EU's image around the world and made the integration model seem ineffective and questionable. The EU's soft power, long considered its most effective instrument for external action, has been severely weakened by the crisis. Financial crisis has weakened Europe's soft power and reduced the means available to Europe to pursue its foreign policy interests. It has less weight in the world. Perhaps more significantly, geopolitical challenges have highlighted the inadequacies of Europe's foreign and security policy. The Arab Spring has brought huge geopolitical change in our neighbourhood. American pivot towards Asia and persistent signals from Europe's ally that it expects Europe to take care of its own security. The revolution in Libya has made it clear that there is likely to be less US involvement in the future, and the US keeps signalling that Europe needs to acquire the capabilities to defend itself and to take action. Biscop, which is one of the people we looked at, studies that he produced, argues that no single EU member state can acquire these capabilities alone, but that instead it is efficient to do so collectively. He argues that the EU member states need to establish what type of capabilities Europe collectively wants to have of what it wants to do with these capabilities. The issue of inadequate defence in this geopolitical environment was raised at a seminar in the IIEA on the 30th of April by the chairman of the EU Military Committee. He proposed that inadequate defence is an essential part of Europe's security and expressed concern that the EU is progressively disarming in a world where all others are arming. He argued that in the context of reduced spending on defence by each member state, the need for collaboration and cooperation in defence is even greater. He cited the close relationship between the CSDP institutions, European Defence Agency and the EU Military Committee as important in providing good linkages and good knowledge about the capabilities required and those supplied. He also cited in a number of new projects approaches as important to developing the military capacity of the EU. 1, the development of defence clusters between group states. 2, in the creation of a European auxiliary fleet. And 3, enhanced cooperation and medical support in EU operations. Academic Daniel Kahan describes the case for an EU military option as follows. The 30 or so CSDP missions to date have been small and largely civilian operations, concentrating on humanitarian and state-building tasks. While it may be that, for the present, the EU does not need to carry out military operations on a scale of those of the UN or NATO. It is risky to assume that the situation will not change. Why is this? First, the world around Europe may become a more dangerous place, and war and instability in Syria and Libya, Iran's nuclear program, and the ongoing disputes in the Caucasus are cases in point. Secondly, for reasons outlined above, the EU will increasingly have to assume roles previously played in and around Europe by the United States. At the December 2013 European Council Summit, defence is on the agenda for the first time in 5 years. Kahan suggests that during 2013, Europeans should focus on improving 3 things: combining military and non-military resources, developing military capabilities, using defence policy as a form of diplomacy. Some analysts are even more critical of EU's action on the international scene. Youngs, which was one of the other people we looked at, criticises Europe's flawed approach to multilateralism, its weak security policies and failure to come to terms with the realities of Islam